Hello again for our next mini. This is the second plague. As I mentioned in the last one, we're going to jump right into things. If you missed the first one, go back and check that out. I give a little bit of an explanation of how we're approaching the 10 plagues. Exodus chapter 8, verse 1 to 15. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go in to Pharaoh and tell him, this is what the Lord says, let my people go, so that they may worship me. But if you refuse to let them go, then I will plague all your territory with frogs. The Nile will swarm with frogs. They will come up and go into your palace, into your bedroom, on and onto your bed, into the house of your officials and your people, and into your ovens and kneading bowls. The frogs will come up to you, your people, and all your officials. Then the Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron, stretch out your hand with your staff over the rivers, canals, ponds, and cause the frogs to come up into the land of Egypt. When Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, the frogs came up and covered the land of Egypt. But the magicians did the same thing by their occult practices and brought frogs up onto the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, appeal to the Lord to remove the frogs from me and my people. Then I will let the people go, and they can sacrifice to the Lord. Moses said to Pharaoh, you may have the honor of choosing. When should I appeal on behalf of you, your officials, and your people, that the frogs be taken away from you and your houses, and remain only in the Nile? Tomorrow, he answered. And so Moses replied, as you have said, so that you may know that there is no one like the Lord our God. And the frogs will go away from you, your houses, your officials, and your people. The frogs will remain only in the Nile. After Moses and Aaron went out from Pharaoh, Moses cried out to the Lord for help concerning the frogs that he had brought against Pharaoh. And the Lord did as Moses had said. The frogs in the houses, courtyards, and fields died, and they piled them in countless heaps, and there was a terrible odor in the land. But when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he hardened his heart and would not listen to them, as the Lord had said. So, first and foremost, we recognize the God who is likely being addressed. I say likely because, again, like the first plague, there is a whole lot of deities that we could choose from that could potentially fit the bill here. Something like 1,500 deities in Egyptian mythology. The Nile has a handful of different deities. There's a host of different things that could be being addressed in this passage and in this plague. The likely one, the one that makes most sense, and the one that most people kind of turn to, is the goddess, the fertility goddess, Heket. Heket. Again, I think that's how you pronounce it. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it, but there is a similarity, maybe a tangential connection between the god of the Nile, the fertility god, male god of the Nile, in Hapi, who we talked about in the previous mini, and this fertility goddess, female, in this second plague. they're not husband and wife, at least not that I've ever seen. They're not husband and wife. There's no sort of connection there, and that happens a lot in mythology and things of that nature. But they're both gods of fertility. They're both goddesses of fertility. The difference maybe is Happy, the god of the Nile, is likely going to be prayed for first and primarily whenever you're worried about your crops, whenever you're worried about your fields growing and things like that, because it's the Nile River. The Nile River is bringing fertility to your land. But you're also going to pray to him for fertility for your wife, right? But much more likely crops. Hecate is going to get prayers and worship and sacrifice much quicker. Again, both are going to be true, but much more readily for your spouse, for your wife, right? Like, I want my wife to have a child. I want my wife to have a son. I want whatever. So I'm going to pray to the goddess Hecate. You can see in the image here, this way, that Hecate has a frog's head, but a female body. This is something that's very, very common in Egyptian mythology. You see a lot of gods and goddesses with human bodies, but with an animal head, an animalian type head. We'll see this a few times as we go through this list. We don't really think very highly of frogs. In fact, we probably think very, very unhighly of frogs. And so it's kind of strange for us to see this. This is a commonly seen as good animal in Egypt. Actually, there's evidence of frogs being embalmed with important figures in Egyptian history. Different people we found with their tombs having either frogs carved on them or quite literally frogs preserved for 1,000 years for the sake of the frog being with them in the afterlife, because there's some symbolism that's going on here. And I think there's a couple reasons for this, or a couple things that are happening that do apply to what we're looking at. The first is that frogs can be considered a delicacy, right? That you can eat frogs, and in a time and a place when you can't go down to the corner market and just get hamburger. You probably are going to go gigging for some frogs and get some frogs and have some protein in your diet. But the reason why frogs are kind of seen in a very in the light of fertility is similar to how we would talk about, say, rabbits in our culture. Rabbits are very prosperous. They grow at an incredible rate, right? They have babies very, very short gestation period and things like that. But frogs are similar, but different. Obviously, they're reptiles, but frogs lay thousands of eggs at a time. Now, the reality is if when frogs lay thousands of eggs, not all of those eggs are fertilized, and not all of the fertilized eggs will actually hatch into tadpoles, and not all of the tadpoles will survive into adulthood as frogs. But the picture still is there. And what we then notice, right? So in the first plague, there is kind of a turning on its head, or a shifting of the imagery, right? The lifeblood, if you will, of the Nile River is the water brings life to the land. And what happens when we turn this? The life of man, blood, kills everything, right? So there's sort of this turning that's happening in the first plague. Here, it's not a turning. There's not kind of a subtle little thing going on here. This is a direct sort of proof statement of God's power. Again, thinking back to this idea of mayors coming to the president, you don't have really any leg to stand on. God is coming not just now as the God of a people, the Hebrews, but is also coming as a God of power, a God of status. You think that the God of fertility, that is symbolized as a frog, is fertile, but your eggs are not fertilized. The tadpole, or not all of the fertilized eggs survived. Not all the tadpoles survived. And so in proportion, it's a small number that survive to adulthood. So fertility is maybe not your strong suit. And so what does God do? God shows that he is not just the God of a people, but he's also the God over fertility. And all, right, if you will, again, symbolically, whether it's actually all of the eggs or not, that's not even the point. All are fertilized and become living frogs. In even a greater picture, in a time whenever you would expect them not to. At the end of chapter 7, we're told that a week goes by from the water of the Nile turning to blood. Now, some suggest, and I don't ascribe to this, some suggest that really there are very few actual miracles performed, but there's a lot of consequences to the miracles, right? So God turns the water to blood, turns the Nile to blood. That's an actual miracle. But then the frogs somehow, survive because of the blood. I'm not really sure how. Survive because of the blood, but then all of the frogs die. What comes to dead carcasses? Well, flies and gnats and locusts and all this, like all of these different things are just in succession. It's too much of a stretch to get to that. Actually, the opposite, I feel like the opposite is true. If the fish are dying, and that term fish is probably more general than it is like we think of fish, aquatic kind of animals, frogs are not going to survive in blood either. The eggs are not going to survive in a land that has no water, fresh water for them to survive in. And so then it's even more surprising that all of these frogs have come into the picture, right? And so God is showing himself to have power and to have authority over even fertility, right? Now for us, we know this. We understand this. This is normal for us. We live in a culture that at worst is monotheistic, at most is monotheistic, one God. We don't live in a culture that thinks of everything having deity, like I said before. This culture thinks of everything through the lens of deity. One last thing that I want to point out as we go through this, just in the response from Pharaoh, again, the Egyptian magicians are able to reproduce this. Again, I think that there is enough sort of internal evidence from the text, internal statement from the text. This is actually some kind of demonic work here. But then Pharaoh has a different response, whereas with the Nile turning to blood, he has little to no response. Now he has some response. And there's kind of an oddity. Moses goes, when do you want me? I'll let you decide. When do you want me to? And that's a very subtle way for Moses to go, look, you don't get to just say, oh, they went away on their own. You will know because you made the time, you decided the time, and I'm going to send them away at that time. And that's what happens. God has them all die, and they heap them up as a reminder to the people of Egypt that this has taken place. Well, it wasn't just a bad dream. And then once again, Pharaoh's heart is hardened. And once again, it is Pharaoh's heart already being hardened. It's not God acting upon him. Now, we're going to get to that as we go through the 10 plagues, but we take note of it as we go through. So again, first plague, happy. Second plague, Hecate. Have an absolutely great week. We'll see you in the next one.